My name is Veth Oron. I hold the rank of Senior Field Analyst, third chair, within the Conclave of Measured Understanding's Department of Planetary Survey and Classification. I have held that rank for 11 years. In those 11 years, I have surveyed the records of 14 active classification events, contributed to 3 reclassification review panels, written 47 incident reports, and sat through more department oversight sessions than I can accurately count. The early ones blurred together somewhere around year 3, when the work settled into routine and I stopped marking them in my personal log. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what kind of analyst I was before this incident. Precise, methodical, reluctant to speculate beyond the data. These are the qualities the Conclave values in its analytical staff, and they are qualities I cultivated deliberately, because I understood early that the work requires them. You do not serve the survey record by inferring things you cannot demonstrate. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that what follows is not the account of a credulous person constructing a story around a surprise. I am going to tell you exactly what the data showed. I am going to tell you what I concluded from it. Where my conclusions remain provisional, I will say so. I owe you that precision, because this supplemental account is going into the sealed annex of Incident File 7 Keth rather than the public record, and the reason it is sealed is not that the facts are in dispute. The facts are not in dispute. Every number I cite here can be verified against the monitoring feed archive, the biosensor relay logs, the atmospheric instrument records from the drone array, and the ship's internal audio log from the Ossel Meridian. The reason this account is sealed is that the facts, read honestly, say something about the Conclave's classification system that the review board is not yet prepared to enter into the public record. I understand that position. The implications are significant, and the additional data needed to substantiate them properly is still years away from collection. I accept the timeline. In the meantime, I want to write down what I saw before the particulars of memory begin to smooth and simplify, as memory does. Survey World Kethdalen was first catalogued by the Conclave's precursor body, the Old Mapping Collective, approximately 230 years ago. At original cataloging, it was rated Class 9, survivable with standard atmospheric processing equipment, surface temperatures within the range tolerable to most carbon-based life, nominal geological stability across the survey period, no significant atmospheric hazards identified beyond thin air and persistent wind. It had been used intermittently since then as a secondary survey base and atmospheric reference point for operations in the broader system. Nothing significant. The sort of site that appears in operational logs as a convenience rather than a destination. The canyon complex in its equatorial band was the one feature that drew sustained attention from survey teams, deep cuts in the surface rock, some running 4 to 6 kilometers in depth, carved over millennia by wind-driven particulate erosion. Geologically interesting. The atmosphere thin, the wind constant and directional. Neither was considered a serious operational hazard under the Class 9 rating. The reclassification happened quickly, as these things sometimes do when an underlying variable has been building quietly for longer than anyone was actively watching. Kethdalen sits within the gravitational influence of a gas giant designated Keth Primary, which dominates the inner system. Every 41 years, the survey world's orbit carries it into a particular resonance alignment with 2 of Keth Primary's inner moons. The tidal stress on the planet's crust increases during this alignment period, not dramatically, not in any way that a surface observer would perceive directly, but measurably and persistently over the several months the alignment holds. The original cataloging's geological modeling assessed this tidal effect as negligible. What the modeling tools of a century ago were not designed to assess was the cumulative effect of repeated stress cycles over 90 years of compounding. The gap in the original analysis was not anyone's fault specifically. The gap was simply there, and it waited. What the accumulated tidal stress did to the survey world's equatorial vent network was open it. The opening was gradual, approximately 6 months in total duration, progressing at a rate the monitoring equipment correctly detected and flagged through the standard reporting channels. The vent network runs beneath the canyon system in the deep subsurface geology, and as it opened, it began releasing trace compounds into the lower atmosphere. The specific family of compounds are organosulfur molecules with molecular structures that interfere, at sustained exposure concentrations, with the cellular respiration mechanics of most known carbon-based life. The interference mechanism is well documented in the Conclave's biochemical hazard library. The compounds are heavier than the ambient atmosphere and accumulate in low points and canyon floors, transported by the wind-driven lower atmosphere currents that run between the canyon walls. They are colorless, near-odorless at low concentrations, and do not produce obvious early symptoms in exposed organisms, which is one of the properties that makes them genuinely dangerous, because by the time physiological effects become clinically apparent, the exposure duration has typically been long enough that the cascade is well established. The monitoring station detected the atmospheric shift and flagged it correctly. The Reclassification Review Board received the flag, convened within the standard review window, examined the accumulated atmospheric data from the monitoring array, consulted the hazard library, and issued the reclassification order. Keth Dahlan was reclassified from Class 9 to Class 17. Class 17 means no biological presence is to be established or maintained at this site. Organisms placed in this environment without specialized atmospheric processing equipment face a projected survival horizon of less than 1 standard day. The environment is classified as incompatible with all known carbon-based life at current atmospheric conditions. The withdrawal order followed the reclassification by 4 hours. There were 3 people on Keth Dahlan at the time of the withdrawal order. 2 of them were Conclave staff researchers, a senior survey specialist named Keth Dorval and his junior colleague, a second-year analyst I will not name here as she has since moved to a different department. They received the order, confirmed receipt, sealed their active sample containers, stowed their equipment, and began the ascent to the extraction platform on the surface plateau. The atmospheric transport collected them without incident approximately 7 hours after the withdrawal order was issued. The third person was not Conclave staff. Her name was Sable Voss. She was 26 years old. She had been contracted 6 weeks earlier through a third-party labor broker as part of the department's cost reduction initiative. The practice was not unusual. The Conclave maintained contracted survey workers from the civilian labor pool for lower-tier field collection tasks, sample tagging, drone calibration, surface measurement confirmation, the kind of meticulous routine work that does not require advanced research credentials, but does require physical capability and tolerance for difficult field conditions. The contracts were short-term. The pay was modest by Conclave standards. The safety protocols were, on paper, identical to those applied to full Conclave personnel. I want to pause on the phrase "on paper." I do not mean to suggest deliberate institutional bad faith toward the contracted workforce. What I mean is that there is a kind of institutional gap that develops over time between what policy documents describe and what operational systems actually deliver, particularly when budget pressures exist and the affected population does not have the institutional standing to push back effectively. The contracted workers received the same safety briefings as Conclave staff. They had the same field equipment. They had the same nominal access to communications and emergency protocols. What they did not have, what the operational system did not actually provide them, despite what the policy documents said, was full integration into the Conclave's notification infrastructure. The Conclave's automated notification system transmits emergency alerts through a communications registry. Conclave staff are registered in the primary registry. Contracted workers are listed in a secondary registry maintained by the Resource Management Division, which interfaces with the primary through a notification bridge. The bridge had a known latency issue. It had been flagged in 2 prior internal reviews as a potential failure point in emergency communication scenarios. It had not been corrected because the correction required a budget allocation that had not cleared the department's annual review cycle in either of the preceding 2 years. The bridge failed. The withdrawal order reached Keith Dorval and his colleague immediately. It did not reach Sable Voss in time. She was in the lower canyon system when the alert failed 7 kilometers from the extraction platform, at a depth of approximately 400 meters below the plateau surface, conducting surface measurement confirmation on a geological anomaly she had flagged 2 days prior. The canyon walls in that section are close, the channel narrowing to 30 meters or less at its widest in the lower formation. The wind at that depth is channeled by the canyon walls into something more directional and less variable than the surface wind, which some field workers find easier to work in despite the confined space. The light comes in as a narrow band from directly overhead, and it moves across the canyon floor over the course of the day in a single slow stripe, east to west. That is the one predictable element in the lower formations. She had been working in those formations for 6 weeks, and she had learned their patterns in the way that people learn environments they work in daily, not by memorizing data about them, but by absorbing them until the patterns become automatic. The monitoring drone dispatched to find her located her signal and transmitted the withdrawal order and extraction coordinates. She acknowledged receipt. She began the ascent. She did not reach the extraction platform before the atmospheric window closed. The atmospheric transport commander had a calculation to make. His vessel's hull seal integrity was rated for Class 12 conditions. The compound concentration in the upper atmosphere, where the transport was operating, was approaching the threshold at which sustained exposure would begin compromising hull seal material integrity. He had 2 Conclave researchers aboard and a crew of 4. He had dispatched the drone. He had requested a window extension from orbital operations and been denied on environmental grounds. He waited to the limit of what the parameters allowed, then made the decision the parameters required. He lifted. Sable Voss was approximately 2 kilometers from the extraction platform when the transport departed. The Conclave standard protocol for a presumed loss determination in a reclassified environment: close the active personnel file, notify the contracting broker for transmission to next of kin, maintain passive monitoring instrumentation on site for 30 days in the event the environmental conditions change enough to make a recovery operation viable. After 30 days with no detected living presence, decommission the passive network and close the site file. The survival horizon calculation for a human from a Class 9 origin world in a Class 17 environment without specialized atmospheric processing equipment was logged at 4 to 7 hours. She had been in the lower atmosphere for the duration of the ascent. By the time the transport lifted, approximately 3 hours had elapsed. The file was closed. I was assigned to write the incident report, standard administrative work. I had the template, the professional competence, the relevant files. I opened the monitoring feed as standard practice to verify the passive network status and log it as part of the documentation. I intended to be finished within 4 hours. I spent 4 hours reading the monitoring feed. I did not write a single word of the report. At the moment the transport lifted, hour 3 of surface exposure in the Class 17 environment, the monitoring drone that had located her during the ascent was still operational. It had followed her upward and was hovering at the canyon rim. Its biosensor array was recording on a standard 30-second cycle. The record was clean. The instruments were functioning within normal parameters. Her core body temperature was 37.1 degrees. Her pulse was 104 beats per standard minute. Her movement pattern was consistent with moderate exertion in rough terrain. She was ambulatory and oriented. She was walking. I looked at the atmospheric compound readings for some time before I could bring myself to run the analysis with full attention. The compound concentration at her location was not an instrument error. The drone's atmospheric modules were functioning correctly. The organosulfur compound family was present at 2.3 times the class 17 lower boundary. The lower boundary is defined at the concentration level, at which the cellular respiration interference effects become clinically significant across a broad range of carbon-based biological types within a standard 4-hour exposure window. 2.3 times that level, sustained for 3 hours in an organism breathing the ambient air through a field suit with no atmospheric filtering capability. A standard Class 9 rated field suit designed for particulate protection and thermal regulation, and absolutely nothing else, should have been producing measurable physiological degradation. I ran the survival horizon calculation 3 more times. I used 3 different models from the Conclave's hazard analysis library. The most conservative gave her 9 hours from first exposure. The least conservative gave her 4. She was at hour 3 when the feed began. The instruments showed no measurable physiological degradation. Her temperature was normal. Her pulse was elevated, consistent with physical effort, not with physiological crisis. She kept walking. I looked at her personnel file. Contracted workers' files come through the broker and are thin by comparison to staff records. Name, age, world of origin, prior survey experience summarized, emergency contact. That was nearly everything the file contained. World of origin, Harren's Deep. I did not immediately know Harren's Deep. The Conclave's survey record covers a large territory and no single analyst knows all of it. I ran the classification search. Harren's Deep. Classification, Class 14. Gravity, 1.4 standard. Atmosphere, dense nitrogen-oxygen with elevated particulate load. Seasonally variable toxin bloom from the native spore flora during equatorial summer. A recurring atmospheric event of approximately 3 months duration, occurring annually. Surface temperatures in the equatorial band ranging from -60 to +58 degrees, standard across seasonal variation. Native megafauna, 37 cataloged large predator species, 18 of which carry a threat class significant rating against most sapient life forms in the Conclave's database. Surface radiation index elevated in equatorial lowlands due to a comparatively weaker magnetospheric field. Geological activity, high, active tectonic with significant seismic event frequency in the primary survey zones. Class 14. I read the entry 3 times. I looked at the compound concentration readings on the monitoring feed. I went back to the classification entry. I thought about the survival horizon calculation and the baseline it used. The calculation inputs origin world data at the standard biological baseline, which is calibrated to worlds in the Class 6 to Class 10 range, because that is where the majority of the Conclave's survey database organisms originate. It does not query the specific origin world classification as a variable unless the case has been flagged for special review. This case had not been flagged. Nobody had noted that the contracted worker was from a Class 14 world, because the flag pathway for that consideration does not exist in the current protocol. I was noting it now. Hour 5. The monitoring drone tracked her to a position approximately 300 meters east of her hour 3 location. She had built a windbreak from loose surface stone, a low curved arc set into the face of the canyon wall, oriented to use the existing rock geometry as a baffle against the primary wind direction. The construction was functional and correctly placed. She was behind it. She was eating from a sealed field ration pack. Her core temperature was 37.1. Her pulse had dropped to 91. I ran a microenvironment analysis at her position. The organosulfur compounds, being heavier than the ambient atmosphere, pool in the lowest available points and move with the lower atmosphere wind currents through the canyon floor channels. Against the canyon wall, in the relative stillness created by a well-positioned windbreak, with no low point pooling directly in that zone, the local concentration gradient was measurably lower than in the open floor channels. Still above the Class 17 lower boundary, I estimated 1.7 to 2 times the boundary concentration, depending on the wind direction in the preceding hour. Still, by every model I had, incompatible with sustained biological function. But lower than open exposure, meaningfully lower. She had identified this differential without atmospheric analysis instruments. She had assessed the canyon environment, the wind patterns, the stone geometry, the way the lower strata air moved, and she had placed her shelter in the position that would give her the best available reduction in exposure concentration. She had done this correctly, and she had done it without the data the Conclave's instruments were providing me in the analysis room. She had 6 weeks of working in that canyon. She knew where the air sat and how it moved. She had integrated that knowledge into a survival decision without pausing to theorize about it. I thought about that for a while. Hour 7, she was moving again. The drone tracked her east into the section of the canyon where the geological anomaly was located, a zone showing unusual stratigraphy in the canyon walls, bands of contrasting material in near-vertical lines from floor to rim, suggesting a deformation event in the deep geological past that the surface survey had characterized only partially. She had flagged it 2 days before the reclassification as a point of interest warranting additional measurement. She had her survey kit out. She was continuing her survey. I read that observation in the drone feed, and I sat with it for a considerable period of time. I will not try to describe precisely what I was thinking, because the honest answer is that my thinking was not yet organized into something that could be described cleanly. What I had was a kind of cognitive friction, the resistance that occurs when data persists in contradicting expectation, and the expectation has not yet adjusted to accommodate the data. She was in a Class 17 environment. She was alive at hour 7. She was taking measurements. These facts did not fit together in any framework I had, and I did not have a new framework ready. I was still building it from what the instruments were showing me. I looked at the field notation entries on her survey tablet. The drone's relay included equipment telemetry. The measurement entries were clean and precisely spaced. Calibration notes were logged at the correct intervals. She had added notation on atmospheric interference at the measurement points, which was the correct field protocol for conditions where atmospheric anomalies might affect instrument readings. Her notation was following the department's standard field documentation format correctly. Her handwriting on the stylus input tablet, she preferred stylus input, readable from the pressure signature in the input records, was steady. Hour 9. She rested again in the side cleft she had used before, returning to the position she had identified as offering reduced exposure. Her core temperature had drifted to 37.2, pulse 86. The cleft position was working in the limited way that the available physics permitted. She was managing the exposure as a variable rather than treating it as a terminus. I thought about that distinction for some time. Hour 12. She was in the side cleft again for a longer rest period. Core temperature 37 degrees flat, pulse 79. She was asleep. Sleep requires a sufficiently reduced threat assessment state to permit the suspension of active consciousness. I understood this as a physiological and neurological fact. The implication of that fact in this context was that she had assessed this environment, this Class 17 environment, in the cleft with the compound still running at my estimated 55 to 60% of open canyon concentration levels, still above the Class 17 boundary by any measure I could construct, and determined that the threat level was stable enough to permit recovery sleep, that the physiological benefit of rest outweighed the risk of reduced alertness in the confined exposure environment. I thought about what it would require to make that assessment confidently. I thought about the megafauna on Heron's Deep. I thought about what sleep looks like when you have grown up on a world with 18 significant threat predator species, and a 3-month annual toxin bloom and gravity that runs 40% above the standard baseline for most sapient life in the Conclave's database. I thought about the fact that she had chosen the cleft in the dark. The survey world's rotational period had taken the light stripe away from her location nearly 2 hours before she entered the cleft, and that choosing a defensive shelter position in the dark means reading the environment through means that do not depend on direct visual assessment. Wind sound against stone, ground texture underfoot, the acoustic signature of enclosed spaces versus open canyon, the way the wind changes when you are sheltered from it versus when you are in it. She had read the canyon in the dark and picked the correct position, and then she had gone to sleep. I typed several paragraphs of the incident report. I read them back. I deleted them. They described an incident that the monitoring feed was telling me had not occurred. Hour 15. She was awake in the light again, eating and organizing her field kit before resuming movement. Her temperature was 37.1, pulse 94. The organosulfur compound concentration in the canyon had continued to rise overnight as the vent network maintained its slow, steady output into the lower strata. It was now running at 2.8 times the Class 17 lower boundary. I made a note in my working file. The models are wrong for this person. I did not know yet precisely how to characterize the reason, but the models were wrong, and I needed to understand why before I could write the incident report as anything other than a bureaucratic error. Hour 17. Moving again back to the anomaly zone, survey kit in hand. I watched the field notation entries update in real time, measurement confirmations, spacing, calibration checks. She was expanding the measurement grid. The original survey plan called for a standard coverage density in the anomaly zone. She was working at approximately twice that density. She was not following the survey plan. She was following what the anomaly told her it needed. I filed an authorization request to Paul Dovin for a retrieval ship. I made the case on 3 grounds. The presumed loss determination was factually incorrect, as the subject was observably alive and functional. The monitoring feed data represented an anomalous dataset of scientific significance that would be lost if direct contact was not established. And the Conclave had a procedural, and I argued, a moral obligation to contracted personnel under its care that was not fully discharged by a presumed loss designation when the designated individual was demonstrably not lost. Paul Dovin approved the request within the hour. He told me later he had been drafting it himself when mine arrived. The retrieval ship was the Keth System Patrol Vessel Ossel Meridian, medium-range atmospheric transport with full hazardous environment hull sealing rated to Class 16, retasked from the outer system. Estimated arrival at Keth Dahlan, 22 hours from dispatch. That put her at roughly hour 39 on the surface when extraction would occur. Hour 21. She had returned to the anomaly zone and added 16 new survey points beyond what the original plan had designated. The field notes accompanying these measurements showed the characteristic mark of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and is pressing into it rather than pulling back, expanded coverage, tighter spacing, more detailed notation on the directional relationships between measurement points. She was mapping the anomaly from inside it. Hour 23. She rested again in the cleft for approximately 90 minutes. Her rest cycles were occurring at roughly 6 to 7 hour intervals. I recognized this as a managed endurance pacing pattern, short recovery periods distributed through a sustained operation to maintain functional capacity without permitting the physiological debt to accumulate to a performance-compromising level. This is not accidental scheduling. This is learned operational behavior. You pace this way when you have done extended adverse environment work before, and you understand how the body accumulates fatigue and how it recovers from it. Hour 24, core temperature 37.4, the first sustained uptick I had recorded. Still within a range that most species would not consider elevated, but the trend was notable. The compound concentration was now at 3.1 times the class 17 lower boundary. I sent a message to the Oscil Meridian requesting that they advance the estimated arrival if possible without compromising operational safety. They pushed it by 4 hours. Hour 27. The monitoring drone was now down to 3 functioning atmospheric analysis modules. Its own systems were beginning to degrade in the environment it was rated for Class 9 operations in. The positional tracking was intermittent, but the biosensor relay remained clean. Core temperature 37.3, pulse 102, movement consistent with careful terrain navigation through irregular canyon floor. Not fast, not slow. Measured, deliberate footing on broken stone in conditions that had now been sustained for more than a full day. I looked at the elapsed time on the feed and thought about what 27 hours of this looked like from the inside. The air quality that she had described, the atmospheric shift she had detected at hour 2 of the ascent, which was now running 3.1 times beyond the class boundary, had been a constant presence for more than a day. I thought about what it means to operate in an environment that is trying to kill you at the cellular level, continuously, for more than a day, and to have the experience of doing so feel like work rather than catastrophe. To have the threat assessment be accurate enough and the physiological response be sufficient enough that catastrophe remains a background variable rather than a foreground one, and the foreground remains. Check the sample containers, expand the measurement grid, pace your rest, eat on schedule, pick the right place to sleep. I thought about Heron's Deep for a long time during those hours when the Oscil Meridian was transiting, and the feed was showing me a person working in conditions that should have stopped her at hour 4. I looked up the spore bloom event in more detail than the initial classification entry had provided. The equatorial summer bloom on Heron's Deep runs for approximately 90 days. During peak bloom, the organosulfur compound concentrations in the lower atmosphere in the canyon regions, and Heron's Deep has canyon regions, because Class 14 worlds tend toward dramatic geological features, are documented in the monitoring relay data at levels I found notably comparable to what the Keth-Dahlen Canyon system was now producing from the vent network. The compounds are not identical. The molecular structures differ in specific ways that the Conclave's biochemical hazard library would regard as distinct. But the respiratory interference mechanism is in the same family, and the adaptation pathway the human population of Heron's Deep has developed over 300 years of annual exposure does not require the compounds to be identical. It requires them to be mechanism adjacent. Mechanism adjacent was what they were. I also looked at the gravity. 1.4 standard. Every human born on Heron's Deep grows up carrying 40% more gravitational load than most sapient species in the Conclave's database experience. The musculature required to function efficiently in that environment, to walk, to climb, to carry a field kit, and sample containers through irregular canyon terrain at hour 34 of an exposure event, is not the musculature the survival horizon calculation assumes. The calculation assumes the baseline. The baseline is built from a database that is accurate for what it represents. What it does not represent is the physiological profile of a person for whom Class 9 gravity is 40% lighter than home. Consider what that means in practice. From the first day a human infant on Heron's Deep learns to hold its own head up, it is performing that action against 1.4 standard gravity. Every developmental stage, rolling, sitting, standing, walking, running, climbing the rocky terrain of a Class 14 world where the ground is rarely flat and the geology is active, occurs under that load. The skeletal density adapts. The connective tissue adapts. The cardiovascular system, which must work against a gravitational gradient 40% steeper than most sapient species manage, adapts. Not in any single generation, not in any dramatic observable way, but across generations, as the population that survives and reproduces on Heron's Deep is, reliably, the population whose physiology handles the load most effectively, and their descendants inherit that advantage and compound it. There is a paper in the Conclave's Biological Survey Library. I found it in the reference annex of an old survey report from approximately 150 years ago, written by a researcher who had visited Heron's Deep as part of a sector survey sweep, and who had clearly been struck by what he observed there, describing the skeletal and muscular density of the Heron's Deep human population as, and I am paraphrasing here rather than quoting directly, anomalously high relative to the standard human database baseline, in a way that the author found difficult to explain without positing multi-generational adaptive pressure. The paper was filed in the annex. It was not, as far as I can determine, referenced in subsequent classification reviews. It had accumulated fewer than a dozen citations in 150 years. It was the kind of finding that sits in the literature waiting for someone to have a reason to look for it. I had a reason to look for it now. I found 4 more papers in the biological survey literature touching on Heron's Deep human physiology, all similarly undercited, all similarly marooned in annexes and subreports. The picture they assembled, taken together, was consistent. The population of Heron's Deep had been shaped by their environment over 3 centuries, in ways that the Conclave's database did not capture, because the Conclave's database draws its physiological baseline from the populations the Conclave actually studies and maintains research contact with, and the Conclave has no maintained research presence on Heron's Deep. The monitoring relay reports environmental data. The environmental data says, Class 14, challenging on multiple axes, populated by 2 million humans. The database says, human, standard baseline. Those 2 statements are not the same statement, and no one had ever had operational reason to examine the gap between them. I was examining it now, sitting in the analysis room at what was now considerably past my scheduled rest period, with the monitoring feed still open on the first screen, and a rapidly expanding pile of undercited biological survey literature on the second. The thing I kept returning to was not any single finding, but the aggregate of them. Each paper, read alone, was interesting but not dramatic. Here is a skeletal density measurement that sits above the standard database range. Here is an observed respiratory adaptation response to the annual toxin bloom. Here is a cardiovascular efficiency measurement in subjects performing heavy physical work under elevated gravity. Each one, filed in its annex, cited by almost no one. Read together, they described a person who would not die in 4 to 7 hours in a Class 17 environment. They described a person who would assess the environment, adapt to the available conditions, manage her caloric and hydration intake, pace her rest cycles, expand her survey coverage in the available time, pack her samples, walk to the extraction platform, and ask about the workbench. The canyon access trail to the extraction platform has a steep section at the top, a scramble-grade climb, approximately 40 meters of elevation gain in a short horizontal distance, over loose surface material. It is the hardest part of the ascent to the plateau. Most field workers describe it as demanding. I thought about what demanding looks like to a person for whom Class 9 gravity is 40% lighter than home, on a day when she had already been on her feet for the better part of 34 hours in a Class 17 environment. I thought about what it feels like to climb a trail that is technically difficult by standard survey norms when your body was built for 1.4, and this is 1.0. I thought about the organosulfur compounds running at 3.1 times the Class 17 boundary, and what they mean to a respiratory system that has spent 26 years managing an annual 3-month exposure to mechanism-adjacent compounds in the canyon bottoms of Heron's Deep. I thought the classification system rated the environment. It did not rate her. I thought those are not the same thing, and the database does not currently have a category for the difference. Hour 30. The Osel Meridian entered Kethdalen's orbit. Hull seal protocols for Class 17 surface approach engaged. I was on a relay link to the ship's operations deck, talking to the expedition officer, a Conclave staffer named Reth Vaughn, a 20-year field operations veteran. Calm in the way that people with long field experience are calm. Not a performance, not a studied manner, just the baseline steadiness of someone who has made difficult decisions in difficult conditions for 2 decades, and has learned that steadiness is more useful than agitation in the seconds when decisions have to be made. He had reviewed the monitoring feed summary I had sent ahead of the Osel Meridian's approach. He had not asked many questions about it. He had asked one, Origin World. I had told him, Heron's Deep. He had said, that helps, and had not elaborated. I found after the fact that I appreciated that he had not elaborated. There are moments when the professional shorthand of experienced people is more useful than a full explanation, because the full explanation would take time that neither of you has, and you both already know the relevant conclusion. He told me they had picked up the biosensor relay. She was approximately 2 kilometers from the extraction platform, moving steadily in that direction. Her pace had slowed from the midday hours, pulse 109. The compound concentration at the plateau surface, higher than in the lower canyon, where the pooling dynamics and her shelter positioning had offered partial mitigation, was running at 3.4 times the Class 17 lower boundary. He asked me what he needed to know about her. I told him she was from Heron's Deep. There was a pause on the line. Not long. Reth Vaughn said, and nothing else. I thought about what was in that pause. A 20-year field veteran who had worked across a range of survey environments, hearing the Origin World classification and doing the same recalibration I had done, arriving at the same revised understanding of what the instruments were showing, arriving at it in the same amount of time it took to say Some information collapses the relevant distance very quickly. Hour 32. She was at the base of the canyon access trail. The Osel Meridian descended to the extraction platform at hour 32.5, set down, crew at stations, outer hatch ready for decontamination cycle initiation. Hour 34. The exterior hull camera showed the canyon access trail gap in the plateau rock at approximately 400 meters distance. I watched the gap. The plateau surface, flat, gray-beige, windswept, the extraction platform grid visible in the middle distance, the Osel Meridian sitting on it with the sun angle catching the upper hull plating. The trail gap, a narrow break in the plateau rim rock, the final scramble section not visible from the hull camera angle. She came over the edge of the trail and onto the plateau, and she stood for a moment. She had dust on her field suit from the canyon. She had her survey kit on her back. She had the geological sample carrier rigged from her field pack, strapping 6 sealed sample containers in a frame she had assembled in the field to handle the load after she expanded the survey coverage beyond her standard pack configuration. She had collected her samples through 34 hours in a Class 17 environment, and she had packed them correctly, and she was carrying them out. She stood for approximately 4 seconds on the plateau rim, oriented herself, and walked the 400 meters to the Osel Meridian. Her gait was steady, not fast, not labored, measured. She walked up to the exterior hatch and stopped and waited. Reth Vaughn said over the internal channel, "Are we going to make her stand out there?" and opened the hatch. The decontamination cycle, 11 minutes. 3 stages of chemical wash, cold. 2 stages of atmospheric purge, the pressure cycling in the purge stages producing a sinus and ear structure sensation that most species describe as at minimum unpleasant, more commonly as acutely uncomfortable, particularly following extended physical stress and sustained adverse environment exposure. She stood in the decontamination chamber for 11 minutes. The inner hatch opened. Reth Vaughn had come down from the operations deck himself to meet her. He told me afterward that he could not identify a specific procedural reason to do so, but had found himself doing it anyway. She came through the inner hatch, and the first thing she said, verbatim, confirmed by the ship's audio log, was, "I need to check on the integrity of my sample containers before I file the handover documentation. Is there a secure workbench available, or should I use my field kit?" Reth Vaughn told me later that nobody in the operations bay said anything for a few seconds. He told her there was a workbench in the secondary hold. She went to check her samples. I have spent considerable time since then examining what was happening in my own thinking during those seconds of silence on the relay link. I had spent 34 hours in the analysis room with the monitoring feed open and the reclassification data on the second screen. I had spent 34 hours watching the instruments report things they were not supposed to report. I had revised my internal model of what the limits of biological function looked like, substantially, over the course of those hours. I had done it alone, in a quiet room, in conversation only with Paul Dovin and then Reth Vaughn, and those conversations had been brief and professional, and had not touched on what I was actually thinking about. What I was actually thinking about, what the silence in the Osel Meridian's operations bay was, I believe, a version of was this. The Conclave's classification system is a tool, a very good tool. Built on 230 years of accumulated observational data, refined by thousands of researchers, updated continuously as the survey record grows. It is the best tool the Conclave has for answering the question, can something live here? It answered that question about Kethdalan. It said, no. It was wrong. Not because the environmental data was incorrect, not because the compound concentrations were misread, not because the atmospheric modeling was flawed. All of those were accurate. The environment was exactly as hostile as the classification said it was. Every organism in the Conclave's database would have had the survival horizon the calculation projected. The calculation was wrong because Sable Voss was not in the Conclave's database. The database has a baseline. The baseline is accurate for the range of organisms it was built to represent. What it does not represent is the far end of the distribution, the point where 300 years of generational adaptation to a Class 14 environment and 26 years of individual biological development within that environment, and 7 years of field work in progressively more demanding survey conditions, produces a person whose physiological responses to atmospheric hazard fall so far outside the standard model's assumptions that the model outputs are not exactly wrong. They describe someone else. I interviewed Sable Voss 6 hours after the retrieval. She had checked her samples, submitted the field documentation for the expanded survey work, eaten a full meal, changed out of the field suit. We sat in the Osel Meridian's briefing room. She looked the way that people look after extended hard field work, a specific kind of tired that rest will repair, present in the eyes and the quality of stillness between sentences, but not structural, not the kind that suggests anything has been damaged at a level that matters. Her field suit was folded on the seat beside her. She had folded it carefully. She was going to use it again. I asked her when she had understood that the environment had changed. She thought about it. She said around hour 2 of the ascent. She had noticed a change in the quality of the air, a faint sharpness that was not like anything the canyon had been doing when she arrived, but was not entirely unlike the early edge of the spore bloom season on Heron's Deep. She recognized it not from the analytical instruments, but from the way certain atmospheric compounds register in the upper respiratory tract before the concentration is high enough to appear on standard field equipment. She had grown up learning to read that register. She had not known what specific compounds were present in Keth Dalen's atmosphere. She had known that the air had changed, and that the change required adaptation. I asked her what adaptation looked like. She said I adjusted. I asked what that meant specifically, and she answered in precise operational terms. She slowed her breathing rate and reduced her activity level where reduction was compatible with reaching the platform. She identified the heavy accumulation zones, the low-channel sections of the canyon floor, recognizable by the way the light scattered differently in the lower strata, a particulate density signature she had learned to read on Heron's Deep, where the spore bloom runs heavier in canyon floors than on open plateau surfaces. She avoided those sections where the terrain allowed. She used the side cleft for shelter because it was elevated slightly from the main floor, and its wall geometry blocked the lower strata airflow. She ate and drank on a regular schedule because she had learned that the body's capacity to manage a sustained atmospheric challenge is significantly degraded when caloric and hydration deficits compound the primary stress. She described all of this in the same voice a field technician uses to describe a measurement procedure. Clear, specific, without drama. These were not emergency decisions. They were the standard adaptations of someone managing a familiar category of problem with the tools she had available. I asked her if she had been afraid. She considered this for a moment, not hesitating, deciding whether the question had an answer that would communicate accurately. She said, I thought about whether the survey notes were complete enough to file. I thought about whether my samples were sealed correctly and would hold integrity until extraction. I thought about the secondary access trail to the platform and whether it was clearer than the primary, because the primary has a loose section at the top in high wind, and I wanted to know my options. A pause. She said, I knew the air was bad. I've known bad air before. I figured I'd either make it or I wouldn't, and either way the survey notes were going to be filed. I wrote that down verbatim. I have read it a number of times since, and I find that it requires no additional interpretation. It is a complete and precise description of the operating state of a person who has learned, over 26 years on a Class 14 world and 7 years of field survey work, to treat the question of individual survival as an accurate but ultimately background variable. The foreground is the work. The work gets done. If you make it, you file the notes yourself. If you do not, the notes are there to be recovered. I want to try to explain what it meant to hear that, and to hear it in the specific voice she said it in, even, unhurried, the kind of voice that is not performing steadiness, because it does not need to perform it. I had been in the analysis room for the better part of 2 days by that point. I had filed the retrieval request, managed the communications with the Oscil Meridian, maintained the monitoring feed log, run the atmospheric models repeatedly, and worked through the biological literature on Heron's Deep in the hours when the monitoring feed was showing me things I had already seen and only needed to confirm were still true. I had been building, piece by piece, an understanding of what I had witnessed, and the understanding was still incomplete in ways I found genuinely uncomfortable. The discomfort was not about her. She was fine. She had been fine in ways the instruments had told me about in real time, so the discomfort was not surprise or relief. It was something more like the intellectual vertigo of having a framework fail and not yet having the replacement fully constructed. The classification system is the foundation of everything the Conclave does operationally. It is the agreed-upon answer to the agreed-upon question, and the answer is useful because it is reliable, and it is reliable because it is consistent, and it is consistent because it rests on a database that is comprehensive for what it covers. I had spent 11 years trusting that foundation. I still trusted it, but I had also spent 2 days watching it fail for a specific person in a specific environment, and the failure was not a malfunction. The failure was a gap. The database did not contain her, and the database did not know it did not contain her, and there was no alert that fired when the survival horizon calculation was run on an organism that fell outside the database's valid range. That is what I found uncomfortable. Not that the system failed. Systems have limits. What I found uncomfortable was that the system did not know it had limits and had no mechanism for flagging a case where those limits were relevant, and would have filed her as a confirmed loss in the formal record if the monitoring feed had not stayed on, and I had not been the analyst assigned to read it. I thought about the 47 incident reports before this one. I thought about whether any of the other 46 had involved contracted workers from high classification worlds, and whether the survival horizon calculations on any of those cases had been run against a baseline that underestimated the subject. I did not have time to review all 46 in detail during the incident window. I flagged it in my research note to the Biological Survey Division as a secondary question requiring investigation. I do not know when that investigation will occur. I thought about the contracted workforce more broadly. The Conclave maintains survey contracts with workers from a range of worlds. The labor broker pool draws from whatever populations are willing to take the contracts, and the contracts pay modestly, and the populations most likely to take field survey contracts for modest pay are often populations from harder worlds, worlds where the work is physically manageable because the baseline is demanding, worlds where the economic incentives to take an off-world contract are more compelling than they would be for the comfortable middle range of surveyed civilization. Which means the contracted workforce is likely, in aggregate, to skew toward higher classification origin worlds relative to the Conclave staff researchers. Which means the survival horizon calculations for contracted workers in reclassified environments may be systematically, reliably off in a direction that the current protocol has no mechanism for catching. I included this analysis in the research note. I flagged it as a second-order finding requiring separate review. I do not know what the Biological Survey Division has done with it. I suspect the review will take time. These things take time. The budget to fix the notification bridge took 2 years to approve, and that was a concrete operational system with a clear failure mode and 2 prior flags in the review record. Revising the survival horizon calculation to query origin world classification and apply appropriate adjustment factors will require biological data the Conclave does not yet systematically collect, from worlds the Conclave does not currently maintain research presence on, funded by budget allocations that have not been requested because the problem has not been formally recognized. I do not know how long all of that will take. I know that the review board will revisit it. I know that Paul Dovin has flagged it at the departmental level. I know that the research note is in the queue. I have done what I can do from where I sit, which is write down what I saw accurately, flag it through the correct channels, and wait for the process to work. The process worked slowly. The Canyon worked quickly. Sable Voss was faster than either. I have one more thing to say before I close this account. In the interview, after she described her operational adjustments in the Canyon, I asked her one more question. I asked her whether she had had any indication, at any point in the 34 hours, that the environment was working on her in ways she could not manage, whether the compounds had produced any symptoms she recognized as warning signs that the exposure was approaching her limits. She thought about this for longer than she had thought about the other questions. Not because the answer was complicated. I thought more because she was trying to be precise about a thing that was difficult to describe with precision. She said, the air got heavier around hour 22. Not heavier in the way that means the concentration went up, though it did. Heavier in the way that means you're aware of it as a continuous fact instead of a background one. You go from operating with it as a parameter you've accounted for to operating with it as a thing you're managing in real time. She said she had experienced that transition before, during bad spore bloom years on Heron's Deep, and she knew from experience that the transition point was not the limit. It was the point at which you had to be more deliberate about everything you were doing, not the point at which the thing stopped working. She said, there's a version of that transition that means you've crossed a line. And there's a version that means you've hit a headwind. I've crossed the line before on Heron's Deep, and I know what that feels like. This wasn't it. This was headwind. She picked up the cup from the table beside her, found it empty, set it back down. She said, I've been in worse. I wrote that down too. I have thought about it since. I have thought about what worse looks like on a Class 14 world, and I have thought about the fact that she was 26 years old and had 7 years of field survey contracts behind her, and had spent 26 years before that on a world the Conclave rates as 2 classifications below what we formally define as incompatible with all known carbon-based life. I have thought about what it means for the word worse to exist in that sentence. I do not fully know what it means. I know what the instruments said. I know what the models said. I know what she said. Those 3 things do not fully reconcile with each other, and the reconciliation will require data the Conclave does not yet have and research frameworks that have not yet been built. That is the honest state of my understanding. It is also, I think, an accurate description of where the Conclave's understanding should go from here. The canyon is still there. Keth Dahlon's classification stands at Class 17 and will stand there until the resonance alignment passes and the vent network begins to seal, which the atmospheric modeling projects to take approximately 3 more years. The geological anomaly Sable Voss was surveying, the subsurface crystalline formation she documented through 34 hours of Class 17 surface exposure, expanding her measurement grid by 16 points because she was there, and the anomaly warranted it, has been flagged by the Survey Division as a priority follow-up target when surface access again becomes viable. The flag is based on her data. Her samples are in the archive. Her survey notes are the most detailed characterization of that formation in the department's record. The formal incident report is in the public record. It is thorough, correctly written, and arrives at the procedural recommendations the notification system failure requires. It assigns accountability correctly. It recommends specific remediation steps. Those recommendations matter. They are the reason the formal report is public and this account is not. This account is sealed because it concerns something the department is not yet prepared to say publicly. That the Conclave's classification system accurately described the Keth Dahlon environment and gave a survival projection that was correct for every organism in its database, and was wrong about this particular person. And the reason it was wrong was not bad data or flawed modeling, but a gap in the database. A gap where the physiological profile of a 3rd-generation Heron's Deep native, shaped by 300 years of Class 14 adaptation, and a personal history that the survival horizon calculation did not query and would not have known how to use if it had, simply does not appear. Paul Dovin told me last week that I will be assigned to the follow-up survey review for Keth Dahlon when the classification permits renewed surface access. He said it seemed appropriate, given the existing file. I told him I would be ready. Before the Oslo Meridian docked at the relay station, before Sable Voss disembarked for the transit connection back to Heron's Deep, I spoke to her briefly over the relay. I told her the models had given her 4 to 9 hours, 3 independent modeling systems. I told her I had spent 34 hours watching the models be wrong and was still constructing my understanding of why. She picked up her pack, field suit folded at the top, sample containers receipted and in Conclave custody. A transit connection to make, back to the Class 14 world she had come from. She said, "You rated the canyon. You didn't rate me." Then she walked through the hatch. I sat at my station after the link closed. The incident file was open on my screen. The canyon was still running at 3.4 times the Class 17 lower boundary. The classification was correct. The environment was what it was. The survey notes were filed. The anomaly was documented. The samples were in the archive. The canyon is still there. So is she.